So, on the schedule, a little bit fascistic about schedules. It keeps me on track. Reading Oedipus the King, and then the various issues, they'll come up in different ways, not necessarily in exactly that order. And but first, I want to make a couple of remarks. So yesterday was like was a long setup, and a setup for a reading of the tragedies themselves, which is really where the spade turns. So I want to move into that today. To summarize, something we could summarize from yesterday, I was thinking about this, we could just say something like the following. Tragedy presents a conflictually constituted world, defined by unknowability, defined by opacity. I want to focus on that word. It's a world, the world of tragedy is a world that cannot be rendered fully intelligible through some metaphysical first principle or set of principles. And as such, and this was the payoff of the first lecture for me, and the importance of the quotation from Bernard Williams, the experience of tragedy poses a serious objection to the invention that we call philosophy. Insofar as philosophy is an invention that has been articulated most often around some first principle. That first principle for Plato is form, idea, eidos. That's the grand claim I want to make. I don't know how this will sound, is that tragedy is the experience of transcendental opacity. Transcendental opacity, in the sense in which philosophy from its inception has been a transcendental enterprise. Transcendental not in the sense of something necessarily transcendent, and there's an important distinction that people often fail to make between the transcendental and the transcendent. The transcendental is the articulation of the conditions of possibility under which experience is possible. The transcendent is something to do with the beyond. There are people, maybe Plato was one of them, who conflate the two. The conditions of possibility for experience in the world are explained with reference to something that transcends it. If the forms in Plato are those things, and that's a subject of healthy debate. Maybe it's clearer in the early Christian thinkers and the medievals, for whom the conditions of possibility that explain experience in the world are given by that transcendent entity called God. But in the modern era, if you accept that view, and I don't, the transcendental survives. Philosophers are articulating conditions of possibility which are conditions of transparency. But those conditions of possibility can themselves be immanent. And that would be, say, Spinoza. Spinoza, the great philosopher of immanence, for Deleuze, right? The Christ of philosophers, as Deleuze calls him, with intended irony, because Spinoza was hardly Christian. But
can you give me the definition of the transcendental?
Conditions of possibility.
Just the conditions of possibility.
Conditions of possibility for experience in the world.
Okay.
For Kant, those are the categories of the understanding. Right? For Spinoza, those are the axioms that are laid out in the first pages of the Ethics. For Badiou, it's what he articulates in being an event. Right? Badiou is although in a sense is a thinker immanent in a certain way, it's about the articulation of a series of transcendental conditions of possibility. So the philosophical enterprise is very much, can be conceived in that way. Tragedy points towards something opaque. We don't have that transparency. It's as if we are confronted with a world where people don't know. They're disorientated. They ask questions. And we find them in a situation of conflict. And that's what I'm going to try and defend. I can say more about that. Is that distinction helpful? Transcendental, transcendence, an important distinction to get sort of clear. Transcendent, what transcends the world. Transcendental, what are the conditions of possibility under which a world might become possible. So, for Kant, the world is all this empirical stuff, right? With a manifold of intuition, as he calls it, sensuous particulars, these things. And we make sense of those through concepts. I put the intuition book under the concept book, and it becomes a matter of knowledge. Right? There is a book on the table. It's an empirically provable proposition. Okay? The conditions of possibility for such concepts are the categories of the understanding laid out in the transcendental analytic. But they're entirely, the claim is that they're that by virtue of which experience becomes intelligible. Right? I don't know why I'm talking about Kant, but it's a good example. Why is the world not just a disorderly, chaotic place? Why is there a world that coheres? Right? Why does it feel like there's a unity to the world of some sort? Kant will say, well, that's given by these concepts that are implicit in our activity. Other people disagree. Hume had a quite different view. But anyway, I digress. I want to say a word about comedy. And maybe say less of a word about comedy because it came up dinner last night. If tragedy is about the disjunction between the past and the present, I'm going to try and show that very concretely this morning, then comedy feeds on the present. Comedy is always the comedy of what's happening now, which is why comedy dates so fast. So you read the comedies of Aristophanes, and maybe you get a few laughs out of them, maybe, but they're really hard. You've got to contextualize comedy, right? Which is as true of Aristophanes as it is of Larry David. A particular hero of mine. But in Larry David, in 20 years, it might be really hard to get a sense of what Larry David's talking about. It works off the present. Comedy always feeds off the present. So, that's the first thing to say. So, if we take a play like The Frogs by Aristophanes, just a couple of really quick things. This was a play from 405 BC. Euripides had died 2 years before, and the play describes a situation of disorder in the city. The city of Athens has been taken over by foreigners, by Nancy boys, and by sophists. And the three things are always linked. Right? Foreign, homosexual intellectuals taken over the city. It's always the threat for the Greeks, as it is for the. Think of the. Anyway, there are contemporary versions of that. Think of the animus against French intellectuals in the US, even when they're not homosexual. Obviously, they're sort of foreign and they're sophists. Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is, of course, a sophist. I digress. But the city has been overrun by immigrants. It's a situation that Aristophanes describes. Very interesting. metics in Greek, metiki, immigrants. Again, another fantasy about the ancient Greeks is that somehow there were these people called the Greeks, and they were Greek, and they were ethnically the same. They weren't. There was a common language across the, which became a common language that extended because of Alexander the Great and Greek expansion across the Near East and North African Greek. But there was never any ethnically unified idea of Greekness. And cities are places where foreigners go to work. Always has been the case. Aristophanes sees that as a problem. And he wants to defend, and the play is one where the god Dionysus appears, the city's in crisis, I need to save the city, I'm going to go back to Hades and bring back the tragedian that can save the city. And then the question becomes, who's the top tragedian? There are three: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Aeschylus holds the chair of tragedy in Hades, according to Aristophanes. But Euripides has just descended down there a couple of years earlier. And so who's going to be top tragedian? And so the play, and it's a comedy, ends up with a contest between these two tragedians as who's top dog. The prize is going to be they return to the city, they get their life back, and what they have to do when they get back to the city is to save the city and restore the honour of true tragic art. A debate ensues. It's very funny. It's still very funny. Not that funny, but pretty funny. And then scales are brought on stage, and the work of Euripides and Aeschylus is weighed for its worth, right, on scales, which has greater heft. Right? Aeschylus wins. Euripides is criticised in very interesting terms for making drama democratic. It is seen as a threat. Aeschylus goes back to the city and we then presume proceeds to save the city. Play ends. There's also an interesting final speech where Dionysus, the god, says, "Better not to sit at the feet of Socrates and chatter, nor cast out of the heart the high serious matter of tragic art." Socrates was, for Aristophanes, always figured as a sophist. There's another great play by Aristophanes, The Clouds, which is a satire of Socrates. In his thinkery, persuading young boys that he liked for questionable reasons to come into the thinkery and think with him. And they became useless. Like the European graduate school of his day. Right? Seduction by forms of sophistical intellectualism does nothing, Aristophanes says. And it destroys the martial virtue of the young, which we need in order to save the city. The point being is that comedy in Aristophanes, and arguably for most of its history, has been a conservative activity. The great traditions of comedy are usually conservative. Right? It's a critique of the present, which is a present that's become decadent, fallen, and we need to restore the past. Therefore, we can conduct a satire of the present in order to bring the past back. Right? Exactly the same structure, say, in Jonathan Swift. Gulliver's Travels, that book that we give to kids for reasons that are quite mysterious. Comedy's not just conservative, I could say more about that, but in Aristophanes it's clearly a reaction to what's going on in the present. I could say a lot more about comedy. Aristotle, the Poetics, was conceived as two books originally. A book on tragedy and a book on comedy. The book on comedy was lost. Where was it lost? How was it lost? We don't know. Did it exist? We're not sure of that either. But the Greek text of the Poetics ends with an ellipsis, which would indicate that it was going to continue. If you read the Poetics, Aristotle sets things up in the first chapters to anticipate a discussion of comedy, but he doesn't deliver. But we get some interesting indications. He says a couple of things, just a couple of tiny things. Firstly, and this is how Aristotle is so different from Plato. Mimesis, imitation, which for Plato is a problem. Right? It's deception and all the rest. Aristotle begins the Poetics by saying that human beings are essentially mimetic animals. We learn through imitation. That's what we do. That whole discourse has received a new twist in the whole, quasi-Darwinian discourse on memes that you find at the moment. Right? Memes as you'll find people like Susan Blackmore or other of these sort of the avant-garde edge of contemporary Darwinian discussions, saying that what human beings, or even Dawkins, right? What human beings essentially do is replicate. We're replicating machines. That's what we do. That's Aristotle's view. So mimesis is not such a problem for Aristotle. And it's what art is. Art is mimetic. But art is the mimesis of people in action. Right? Mimesis of people in action. And that can run two ways. It can be the imitation of people in action who are good, and the imitation of people in action who are bad. The term that Aristotle uses is elevated, good, or base, bad. And then you can feel the distinction coming. Tragedy is the imitation of people who are elevated. Comedy is the imitation of people who are base. Right? We all love imitation, Aristotle says. Poetry, and by poetry, Aristotle means the entire realm of what we think of now as artistic production, or media production, if you like, breaks into two branches: the imitation of the noble, tragedy, and the imitation of the base, comedy. The beginnings of tragedy, Aristotle says, originate in the dithyramb to the god Dionysus, which is where Nietzsche picks up that thought in The Birth of Tragedy. The origins of comedy lie in the phallic song. We're not quite sure what the phallic song was. Oh, phallic song. There is a phallus. I don't know. We can imagine. Phallic song, fill in the gaps. But Aristotle says it was obscene and scurrilous. Right? We know from Var's depictions that satyr plays involved, so if tragedy involved a full body costume and a full head mask, comedies and satyr plays in particular, involved a body costume with a huge extended false phallus, right? And a costume that would have been the horned god, the goat god, Dionysus. We know that from paintings. So it would have been bawdy, right? Would have been, and there's, if you read the one satyr play we have, Euripides by Cyclops by Euripides, it's full of farting jokes and shitting jokes and body humour. And then we get the discussion of tragedy. Right? And Aristotle lays it out, and I talked about it last time. And then the book finishes. And there was going to be a second book on comedy, but we don't know what happened. Now, there's a mystery. What happened to the second book of the Poetics? I don't know if you've known, it's a generational issue, but I think it's sort of been passed out of common circulation, but Umberto Eco, right? In the Name of the Rose, which is, fantastic book. Stages a drama in a monastery in northern Italy, which centres on a mystery. And the mystery centres on the library, and at the centre of a library is a forbidden book that kills people. If people find it, they turn the pages are poisoned and they die. That book is the second book of the Poetics. Right? Why does there have to be a forbidden book? And the librarian in the monastery is a parody of Borges, Jorge Luis Borges. It has to be a forbidden book because Aristotle was the philosopher for the medievals, the philosopher. The philosopher who was shown to have been, and basically the whole enterprise of medieval philosophy was showing that the work of the philosopher was consistent with Christianity. Right? Ergo, Thomas Aquinas. That's what Aquinas does with consummate brilliance, based on Arabic interpretations of Aristotle, by the way, or Iranian interpretations of Aristotle. The philosopher could not be seen to discuss laughter. This would be unseemly. So Echo tells a wonderful story. Was there a second book of the Poetics? On your schedule, at the end of session 2, I was going to talk about tragic catharsis versus comic catharsis. Now, I'm a great fan of the obscure. And it doesn't come any more obscure than this. There's an 11th century manuscript called, I've got it on here, the Tractatus Coislinianus. Right? And the Tractatus Coislinianus is a 4 or 5 page summary of a book. Right? And that book is purported to be the second book of the Poetics. Right? And that's about all we know. There's a summary of Aristotle on comedy, which would lead one to deduce that that book, the second book of the Poetics, was in circulation in certainly in the Arabic world, because it was the Arabs that had preserved, Greek philosophy. The Christians were busy, painting their faces blue and killing each other. It somehow found its way into southern Europe and was being discussed. So there's this Tractatus which summarises this book. It's 4 or 5 pages long, and if you get interested in this, I could give you some indications. But if tragic, this is the payoff. If tragic catharsis, as I said yesterday, is the purification of emotions, something like sublimation in psychoanalytic terms, then what is comic catharsis? What this summary from this 11th century manuscript says is that comic catharsis is achieved through hedone, pleasure, and gelos, laughter. Right? And that's about all we get. We don't get much more than that. But it's suggestive. So there was a kind of sublimation through laughter and through pleasure that was at least the complement of the sublimation that we would get through tragedy. And then we can begin to speculate. What form of sublimation would laughter be? I have written a book on this topic called On Humour, where I try and speculate on that. I won't bore you with it now, but I try and give a whole rereading of a number of things, but particularly Freud on humour, to try and show how we can develop a quite different model of sublimation, a comic notion of sublimation. And it's a good topic, and it's still, I think, a terrain that's not really been explored adequately, to say the least. I did some of that last year, comedy business, so I don't want to talk about that now. Anything you want to pick up from that? Because it came up yesterday, and I suppose there is a discussion of comedy which we could have, and sort of the architecture of it, if you like, the conceptual architecture.
Are you asking us if we want to
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, isn't it one of the main ways to do, I would say, at least some sort of resistance to the hegemonic media sphere? Is you're seeing all sorts of, if you look at Daily Show or the Colbert Report, for example, that constantly strive to imitate what goes on in the media, using the same sound bites, sound clips, but flipping it and using comedy to somehow have a catharsis for the audience who knows it's bullshit. At the same time, their bullshit somehow is able to allow for the media to breathe a little bit.
Precisely. Precisely. If we look at that period in recent American history between 2002 to the election of Obama, when the Democratic Party was in its, not disarray, but just a sort of, I don't know, how we describe that? Satire became the opposition, right? And shows like The Daily Show took on extraordinary political importance because the Democratic Party was saying nothing apart from this breaks the law. The law's sort of important, Kerry stumbling around. We need to get back to legality. And anyway, and we could extend that. And that's true. That's true, as it were, period. But the thing is about comedy and politics is that it's a tricky topic. You can spin it one way, you can spin it another, right? And you find exactly, there's nothing, I would argue, nothing in the form of jokes that essentially allows for resistance.
I mean, there's a difference between catharsis and resistance. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
so the comic catharsis is right. So the comic catharsis is that we experience, we're fed a diet of whatever it is, war on terror, and then somebody cleverly says, like John Stewart, this is bullshit, and we feel a sort of relief, a transfiguration of something. We feel, somebody's on our side. We can laugh at those in power. I mean, that's a powerful, powerful tool. And if we look at the history of the links between comedy and resistance historically, it's often had that form. Comedy works much better in totalitarian regimes, or regimes that tend towards tyranny. Which is why, the humour was much better in Eastern Europe under totalitarianism, so-called, than it is now, right? You have jokes like, why do Czechoslovak secret policemen go around in groups of 3? You need one who can read, one who can write, and one to keep an eye on the 2 dangerous intellectuals, right? And that works perfectly, right? But once you have Velvet Revolution and democracy, and liberal democracy, then where does humour go? You end up with the humorlessness of Obama, right? The smiling, vacuous humorlessness of Obama. It's serious. It gets about raw. But we could say more about that. But what you find is the form of jokes, and I've tried to think about this, the form of jokes is another form of ambiguity. So, and that's the function, say, of right-wing talk radio in the States vis-a-vis Obama is exactly the same function as the Daily Show vis-a-vis the Bush regime. And often the jokes will have the same form.
yeah.
Right? Or you'll take, for example, a racist or a sexist joke will have exactly the same form as an anti-racist or an anti-sexist joke. How many men does it take to tile a bathroom? It depends how thinly you slice them. Right? Radical feminist joke from the late 70s has exactly the same form as a sexist joke. It's just inverted. So comedy works through these inversions. But is there something intrinsically revolutionary about comedy, laughter? Well, we have to think about that. Maybe anyone wants to comment?
Well, I was just going to say, same sort of thing, that it can be subversive but doesn't directly challenge the status quo, so they can get away with it.
Yeah.
So Benjamin was a big fan of Chaplin.
Yes.
Because he said that he can challenge, Hitler through the great dictator.
Yes.
And also it has a mass appeal. Because if you were a direct intellectual challenge, the masses would be that interested. So.
It's true. But then we have, and that's true, and Chaplin's a very good example. And then we can think about, if you like, apolitical or less political versions of silent comedy, about Keaton or Harold Lloyd, who are in a sense as funny, but there's not an agenda driving it in quite the same way. So there's a heroic idea of comedy, which is fine. But I think my point is that it's an ambiguous phenomenon, and in the case of Aristophanes, it's clearly a conservative response. Right? The city's in disarray. Comedy becomes a way of subverting those sophists and foreigners that have taken over the city and restoring what is truly Athenian. That's the suggestion.
I mean, it also creates an us and a them.
Absolutely.
With the joke, it creates also allegiances that can be mobilized to get rid of immigrants.
Yeah.
Or to, the other side as well.
In comedy, you construct an enemy. It's very important.
I wonder what the role of the court gesture was within the political system, where the one person was able to tell the truth and get away with it.
Yeah, this is a whole debate, right? The last court jester in Britain, or it would have been England then, I think was in the 1670s. I think James the First, perhaps, the court jester. It disappears with the Glorious Revolution, which initiates liberal democracy. There's a whole story here we could begin to tell about the relationship of fools and folly to power. And does the fool tell the truth to power by inverting the social order, or does the fool invert the social order so the social order might simply be restored, be maintained? And that's the function of carnival, classically in Catholic cultures. Right? Is carnival subversive? I mean, if you read Bakhtin and you sort of get off on that, or Terry Eagleton has a lot of fun with that, sure. And it's all about the body, and the body's great, isn't it? And farting, and boys dressed up as bishops, and we get a sheep in to give a sermon, and that would be funny. Does that destroy the institutions of state and church, or does it simply, through the deviation, reaffirm them? And that's the question.
That deviation, you can view it as a release valve.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the kind of terminology we can use, a social release valve. But that's
You've carnival
bigger
every day.
catharsis in the sense of social catharsis, is the release of something.
Yeah.
But
And that's important. Just before we go, that's important. I mean, tragedy and comedy take place in festivals, right? They're festivals, they're spring festivals. They're festivals of relief and release, where you are liberated from your social functions in order to then go back to them. Carnival in Catholic cultures precedes Lent, which precedes Easter. Right? So the function of carnival is to affirm the triumph of the resurrection of Christ's sake.
the function of the carnivals and the circuses as they tour in, for instance, in America, moments of release from the doldrums of your miserable dust bowl existence, which you then go back to the following day and toil and sweat. But
So comedy is a difficult ally politically.
Yeah,
It's a complex ally.
I wanted to ask, you talked a bit about it last year, but I don't think we had a chance to go into it much. You mentioned Freud's book on comedy.
Yeah.
I read that a while ago.
Right.
And for him, the catharsis is it seemed to me it was a sort of, he uses the term libidinal economy at times, like this almost like tipping point where some joke just short circuits kind of a thought pattern, I suppose, and that's the burst of laughter is this cathartic release. So when you said that in the Greek it was it's not on there, it was hedonism or hedonia, was it pleasure?
Yeah.
Pleasure principle. So this is a kind of a very socially constructed realm that you're in. That it's always a sort of a limpet on whatever, clinging on to whatever these social circumstances are. Sorry, I'm just trying to reconstruct the argument.
That's good. No, I mean, Freud. I mean, the beauty of reading Freud's joke book, 1905 book on jokes, Witz, right, is he doesn't touch it. He leaves it alone. The difficulty of reading the interpretation of dreams, which obviously is the book for Freud, is he kept going back to it and tinkering with it, which makes it really hard to read. There's all these footnotes, different editions. He can't leave the thing alone. The joke book, written on the model of the interpretation of dreams, is basically untouched. And Freud doesn't go back to the topic until 1927, when he writes this little essay on humour. And this is what has interested me. So, if you like, let's risk a diagram here. Let's do psychoanalysis. You can use diagrams in a way. It's used diagrams, just make things up. It's if we go use the unconscious or id, superego, right? The threefold distinction of the psychic mechanism of Freud. Jokes, Freud always tells you what he's going to do. Jokes and their relation to the unconscious. Therefore, jokes have relationship with the unconscious. So when you tell jokes, something about the repressed is articulated. Right? So repressed content surfaces in jokes. So if I go to Metro Bar tonight, which I'm not going to because I risk the use of alcohol at this altitude, if I go to the Metro Bar tonight, have a few beers, and then I go into a series of homophobic jokes, right? I'm enjoying myself. And you think, Simon's really got a problem with homosexuality. There's some repressed content that's being articulated here. That's Freud's point, right? So jokes are the articulation of unconscious desire in its repressed form. So we read the joke as like a scream for what's repressed. Right? That's the argument of the joke book. Very, very simply put. So comedy is a form of relief for Freud, early Freud. In the late essay on humour, he makes a separate argument, which I try to pick up on, which is that in humour, something else happens. What is it? And I mentioned this last year, but just to give you the example, Freud gives an example in the essay on humour, which is the following example, which is to say, a man is going to be condemned to be hanged, and on the morning of his execution, he walks out into the courtyard, he sees the gallows ahead of him, and says, "Well, the week's beginning nicely." Right? And Freud says, what's going on in that joke? What's going on? The conclusion he comes to at the end of 7 pages is that in humour, so jokes have a relationship to the repressed and the unconscious. Humour has a relationship to this thing called the superego. In humour, I look at myself from outside myself and I find myself ridiculous. Right? That's Freud's conclusion. The meaning of that conclusion is unclear. It doesn't really elaborate it. But it would imply that humour can allow us to see the ridiculousness of human life and the tragedy of human life, and can allow us to bear that in some way. So Freud says at the end of the essay on humour, humour elevates and liberates. Elevates and liberates. Doesn't mean that the hanged man isn't going to be hanged. He's still going to be hanged, but he can make that joke, make that humorous aside. So humour gives us the form of not relief. Nothing is relieved. Something is transformed. And this is important. I think this is, we could say a lot more about this with a separate seminar on comedy and humour. But the superego is a punitive master, right? And we know that. If we don't know that, we're perverts. We'll come back to that with Oedipus, because he's a pervert at the beginning of the play. I assume that all of you around the table are not perverts. Let's just make that assumption. You're neurotics, right? And if you're neurotic, you've got some relation to your superego. And your superego is what is punishing you. It's what's making you not sleep at night. It's making you feel like a worthless piece of shit. It's what's inhibiting you from saying, Simon, you're talking a lot of bullshit. It's what's all that stuff is in there, right? And it's the superego that the psychoanalyst has to block in order to do psychoanalytic work. The psychoanalyst, and Freud's model, and I with this thought, is the psychoanalyst has to occupy the place of the superego in order that our self-punishment can be alleviated, or at least transferred onto an agency that gives us, as it were, the space to do something else. Right? So I then transfer all of that shit onto the psychoanalyst, because my father, my mother, everything I love and desire and hate is there, right? Which is why this relationship is so important. Now, that's one story. Humour, Freud says, gives us a transformation in the superego function. Right? The superego is not just this punitive master that is in our heads. It can also be that agency where we look at ourselves and find ourselves ridiculous and laugh. And so, then he says this weird thing at the end of the essay, that there is a possibility of a mature function of the superego, as opposed to, as it were, the childlike function of the superego, which is, the one of, what are you doing with your hands in bed? Stop that immediately. You are a worthless piece of shit. Anyway, so there's a question here and then.
Okay.
Go on. That's the architecture.
I'm wondering if that maturity is in submission or playing the second role, because, a typical night at the Athens Theatre would be tragedy, 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 or comedy, 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 and then the tragedy at the end.
And then the satyr play at the end of the...
And even in Aristophanes' play, he's talking about the need for the top tragedy specialists to come back and save us, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like the submission of, or the supporting role of comedy is where the power is. Almost like, if Jon Stewart's in an interview, he'll say, well, I'm just a comedian, this is just a comedy channel, don't take it so seriously.
I'm not a politician.
Right.
Which of course is,
Right, and somewhere you wrote that comedy acknowledges but doesn't affirm.
Yes. Yes.
So it's almost that the power, the maturity is in that submission, maybe. Or
yeah. A lot I could say about that, but I don't want to, the thing that's so hard for us to make sense of with the ancient Greeks is that the space of suffering, trauma, violence, war, all that stuff that tragedy is about, is the same space as celebration, the body, affirmation. So the third, you would have finished the Oresteia, stage full of dead bodies, Catharsis, if Aristotle is to be believed, and then the stage fills with people dressed with artificial phalluses, wandering around, beating each other with clubs, swearing, farting, shitting, all of that. And there was no contradiction between the two things. That's what we find unintelligible. There's no felt contradiction between those two activities are complementary. The three tragedies were followed by a satyr play, where what was being satirized was the tragedy. Right? The Greeks did not experience a contradiction. This is, and at the end of a couple of millennia of Christianity and a few millennia of monotheism, we find that a very hard thought to swallow. Right? Hard, try as we might.
Excuse me. You said they experienced no contradiction. Does this then lead to a doing away with contradiction, one way of dealing with the problem, the principle of non-contradiction?
Well, maybe it was just experienced as a compliment, as a sort of
a compliment.
Yeah, as what you would expect, that you would undergo the suffering of Oedipus completely, let's say, as you were eating your olives and drinking some water or wine or whatever, probably wine, right? And then the whole thing would be rendered ridiculous. That didn't mean that the lesson of Oedipus was lost. It was somehow in a balance with this other way of...
So if philosophy wants to get rid of contradictions or deal with it somehow or another, or paradoxes or whatever,
Yes.
tragedy is going to bring the...
Yes, this is important. What is and to go back to what we were talking about yesterday, Socrates' target is not just tragedy, it's comedy. The issue is not just excessive lamentation and grief, it's excessive laughter. Right? So what you find, the first philosophical gesture, if that's what happens in Plato's where this begins with a regulation of affect, and I focused on lamentation and grief, but it's a regulation of the affect of laughter, crucially. And the history, can you say that? I don't believe in people that say the history of the West. I'll leave that for Heideggerians. The history of the West is the history of the regulation of laughter. It's much more complicated than that, but that's one way of looking at it. History of Christianity, I've done some work on that. The history of Christianity in relationship to laughter is really interesting. If you look in particular, and we have text on this, on the way monasteries, we have texts which give rules for the direction of behaviour in monasteries. Right? And in those texts it's clear that at what stage one should laugh and should not laugh. It is not seemly for monks to laugh. In the early medieval period, that begins to change in the high Middle Ages, and then you're allowed to laugh, but in certain ways. Right? Smile, but not excessive guffawing laughter. And you can look at this whole, and we're entirely imprisoned within a regulation of affect around laughter. We know exactly how to laugh and how not to laugh. And when someone laughs inappropriately, we're immediately aware of it. If one of you started laughing now, right, we think they're crazy. Or someone laughs too much, or they don't laugh.
So you're
Sorry, you were first, actually.
Actually, my comment was very similar to his. I just wanted to say that somehow I had the impression that in Humour we are not actually dealing with the repressed. We just feel kind of relief, but we are not changing the thing that we repressed. And it's just questionable how much is it. It can be subversive today. I mean, if you have, for example, some research shows that today majority of the people using the comedy shows as a main source of information. So that's really bizarre in a way, because
it's become the news.
If you are getting the information about war in Afghanistan, to laugh, it's really it's just.
It's a very good point. And as as someone from the former Yugoslavia, you know, without, I mean, the great, if like what the Balkans have over the, which of course, you know, Freud thought the Balkans were unpsychoanalyzable, right? Or an image of the unconscious, which is why the Balkan humour is so interesting, right? Because it's the constant presentation of an impossibility, right? I think this, I mean, Zizek is, I think, has to be understood in this context of the comedy of the former Yugoslavia, right? Are those jokes transgressive, restorative? It's like that Czechoslovak joke, right? It's like that. Or you constantly use the limits of the obscene as a way of giving yourself some space and distance in a social context which threatens to be suffocating. But how far does that go? And then there's this problem of, you know, democracy and humour, which is a deep problem. The democracy as political forms go is the least humorous, in a way, the least comic, because in a sense, it's not clear. No, it's not clear with the prohibition. I could say more about that. I didn't include a chapter on politics in the book on humour because I just couldn't get the argument straight. It's just too complicated a topic. And then we should move on.
So your main couplet that you're working with is Greek lamentation and its relationship to philosophy. Now we're expanding it a little bit by talking about the comedy, and you know, even though Christianity might regulate laughter, it's still a divine comedy.
Absolutely.
But I wonder if we can extend the constellation a little bit backwards, and is there a similar, you know, just like with Greek lamentation in its relationship in theater to the law or to the civic law, is there a similar relationship with Jewish lamentation in the law?
Here we go. Yeah, this is good. The Divine Comedy is a comedy because it ends well, right?
Right.
In Dante, there's that. There's an extraordinary tradition of Christian comedy which erupts in the Renaissance. Rabelais is the key figure, but also Erasmus, Praise of Folly, and elsewhere. But if we think about Praise of Folly by Erasmus, what Erasmus focuses on is the folly of Christ, right? Which is there in Corinthians, in Paul's Corinthians. Christ is a fool. Right? He's a fool who dies on the cross for our sins, and he's laughed at by a Roman soldier in the legend that begins to develop around Christianity. So the central act of Christianity is an act of comic folly. Erasmus makes that central to the understanding of Christianity. So there's a certain interpretation of Christianity which would show that Christianity is consistent with a certain understanding of folly, ridiculousness, and all the rest. And I could say a lot more about that. It really interests me.
Another person comes to mind.
But just
Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. I was thinking of Milan Kundera and the novel The Joke, or the novel The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, and so on. I mean, just incredible. Really quite powerful.
And you know, in Kundera, you've got the distinction between the laughter of angels and the laughter of devils.
Yes.
And it's the laughter of devils, of course, which is the most interesting. And he has the example in that book where he talks about a funeral where the coffin is lowered into the ground by men wearing hats, as is appropriate, and as they lower the coffin into the ground, one of the hats falls onto the coffin, and laughter erupts. And at that moment, the ritual of the funeral turns into the anti-ritual of the joke, right? And we recognise that. So comedy is like an anti-rite. And Kundera would be another reference, and then Jewish humour is another kettle of whitefish that I don't know if I want to get into, but for me it's absolutely essential and interesting and all the rest. I don't know what to say. I wouldn't know where to stop.
Well, I'm not
Because
so interested in Jewish humour as in Jewish lamentation, because it doesn't seem like there's a correlate with the theatre, and there is a wisdom tradition, but clearly philosophy, what we call philosophy, is Greek, and so I'm just wondering if you extend the constellation in that direction, if there's any relationship with Greek lamentation and Jewish lamentation.
I don't know. It's a really good topic. I mean, the idea of Greek and Jew is a modern idea, right? Which we then project back in our romanticism into antiquity. I mean, everybody likes to quote that, the epigraph and the final word from Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics. Maybe Diane's talking about this next door, but the quotation from Joyce, Jew, Greek, Greek, Jew, extremes meet, or Matthew Arnold. There are two tendencies in the world: the Hellenic and the Hebraic, and those two forces are in conflict, and culture is a consequence of the two forces. This is a 19th century romantic reconstruction of a fairly pernicious kind. If you read Arnold, Culture and Anarchy, which is a very important text to read in my view, his argument is that it's a critique and diagnosis of English culture. And the argument he makes is that English culture is too Hebraic. Right? The English are the Jews of the modern world. Right? Prohibition of images, the effects of Protestantism, the cultivation of the word, right? And seriousness. It's too much of that. And we need more Hellenic sweetness and light, he says. More of the Franco-Italian influence. That's Arnold's fantasy. On the basis of that, we begin to categorize Jew and Greek in this sense. In the ancient world, it's a complete mess. You just cannot make those distinctions. There were Semitic traders in Athens from as long as there was Athens, right? There was contact with the place that we would call Palestine or Israel, contact particularly with Phoenicia, and there were Phoenician philosophers who were, in a sense, Jewish in Athens. So you really can't, so these are modern ideas we project back. I think it's, and Greekness at best means a language, right? Like English. Does Englishness, entail some ethnic identification? Thank God no, or it shouldn't, right? It's simply a vehicle that we might use for a period of time to try and make sense to each other. Greek was like that. The identification of Greek with Greece, the territory of Greece, is a 19th century pernicious, reactionary, romantic projection, which you find all over the place. You find it in Deleuze and Guattari, in What is Philosophy, repeated, as it were, verbatim. They're really radical, aren't they? Completely reactionary position. I could digress on that. There's something radically deterritorialized about Greekness, and it's constituted not because the usual narrative is that there was this place called Greece, and they invented civilization, philosophy, science, and all the rest, and that was in Europe, and then some things happened, and then sometime later there was Western civilization. And Western civilization is founded on that Greek civilization. And indeed it's a mirror of one to the other. And then idiots like Heidegger can say, there's a correct, there's actual, the two philosophical languages which are appropriate are German and Greek. It's fucking nonsense, right? It's total nonsense. But it's a territorial idea of history. And I think we have to the first thing we have to do is to get rid of any of that. Right? As just a starting point for thinking. And one way of beginning that is, for me, is to begin to think of history more radically, more geographically, in terms of space rather than time. And if we think about, say, whatever Greekness means spatially, we have some kind of space, which for the Greeks was largely the Mediterranean, largely the Eastern Mediterranean, where there were lines of trade, commerce, and movement between peoples, which was constant, as it is now, right? I'm sort of going off on one, I know, but it's like all this nonsense about globalization, right? There's always been globalization. We confused globalization with one globalization, which was European globalization. That was one, and it was a disaster, right? It produced the horrors of all the, you know that. But there were always globalizations. The Persians were globalizing. So, in a sense, and to that extent, if we understand cultures, if you like, tectonically, spatially, and geographically, we end up in a very different place. Then, how would philosophy relate to that spatial, geographical sense? That's really interesting. Philosophers have a crude sense of a timeline, right? There was antiquity, there were these guys, it went boom, 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 and then there's Hegel and Heidegger, whatever. And it's, we have to, this in some disciplines, like in history, to some extent, we've been freed of those models. The way in which the Enlightenment has been thought about the last 20 years through the work of people like Jonathan Israel, others like that. We have an idea of a radical Enlightenment now, which is much more complicated. We're talking about the history of philosophy. What is the history? There's no the history of philosophy. It's a 19th century fiction projected onto the past in order to usually serve nationalist ends, which are part of that very globalization which we want to speak against. I'm ranting, I know. Philosophers are very bad historiographers, and this just, it's pernicious and it's viral, right? And it means you end up talking about things like the West, globalization. For me, Heidegger is the real criminal in this. And you pick up a certain series of superficial historical understandings, buttress them with a bit of romantic philology, and come to extraordinary cultural conclusions, which are entirely vacuous. So watch out, you don't. I won't name names, but there are people, who do that, and it's just, it's thoughtless.